In a world where survival often depends on reputation and respect, sometimes the most unexpected people carry the heaviest secrets. What happens when a quiet woman in her 50s, working the night shift at a downtown diner, reveals a past that makes hardened criminals step back in fear? This is the story of Maria Santos, whose gentle demeanor hid a history with one of the most feared organizations in the underworld, and how one tattoo changed everything in a single moment that would define the rest of her life. Some scars tell stories, some tattoos whisper warnings, and sometimes the person you least suspect has lived through hell and emerged stronger than steel. Maria Santos wiped down the counter for the third time that evening, her weathered hands moving in practiced circles across the worn Formica surface. The fluorescent lights of Eddie's all-night diner cast harsh shadows across her face, revealing lines earned through 53 years of life that had been anything but easy. Outside, the rain pelted against the windows, turning the neon signs of downtown into blurry watercolors against the darkness. She had been working at Eddie's for nearly 8 years now, ever since she moved to this small Nevada town where nobody asked questions and everyone minded their own business. The night shift suited her perfectly. Fewer customers, less conversation, more time to think. Or rather, more time to try not to think about the life she had left behind. The dinner rush, if you could call it that, had ended hours ago. Now it was just her, the cook named Jimmy, who spoke maybe 10 words per shift, and whoever wandered in from the highway looking for coffee and a place to sit that wasn't their car. Maria preferred it this way. Quiet, predictable, safe. She glanced at the clock above the coffee machine. 2:30 in the morning, 3.5 more hours until her shift ended, and she could walk the 6 blocks to her small apartment above the hardware store. She would climb those narrow stairs, deadbolt the door behind her, and try to sleep while the rest of the world woke up. The bell above the door chimed, causing Maria to look up from her cleaning. A trucker walked in, shaking rain from his jacket. He was a regular, came through every couple weeks hauling freight between California and Colorado. Big guy, friendly enough, always ordered the meatloaf special and black coffee. "Evening, Maria," he called out, settling onto his usual stool at the far end of the counter. "Evening, Rick." "The usual?" she asked, already reaching for the coffee pot. "You know it. Roads are getting nasty out there. Glad to get inside for a bit." Maria poured his coffee and called the order back to Jimmy. This was her life now. Predictable conversations, simple routines. Nothing that required her to be anyone other than a middle-aged woman who worked nights and kept to herself. She had worked hard to build this ordinary existence, and she guarded it carefully. Rick sipped his coffee and made small talk about the weather and road conditions. Maria responded with the minimum required for politeness, but her mind was elsewhere. It was always elsewhere these days. Sometimes she caught herself touching her left shoulder, feeling the raised edges of the scar tissue beneath her uniform shirt. Old habits died hard. The bell chimed again. This time, 4 men walked in, bringing with them an energy that immediately changed the atmosphere of the diner. They were younger, maybe mid-20s to early 30s, dressed in expensive clothes that seemed out of place in a roadside diner at 2:30 in the morning. Maria noticed the way they carried themselves, alert, scanning, territorial. She had seen that posture before, many times. They chose a booth near the middle of the restaurant, close enough to the door for a quick exit, but positioned to see anyone coming in. Maria grabbed menus and approached their table, keeping her expression neutral and her body language non-threatening. "Coffee?" she asked simply. "Yeah, coffee for all of us," said the one who seemed to be in charge. He was probably the oldest of the group, with dark hair slicked back and cold eyes that tracked her movements carefully. "And we need to see your boss." "Eddie doesn't come in until 6, Maria replied, filling their cups. "Anything else I can get you?" "Actually, yeah, we need everyone to clear out for a few minutes." Private conversation. Maria's hands remained steady as she finished pouring, but internally she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with danger. She glanced toward Rick, who was finishing his meatloaf and seemed oblivious to the tension that had just filled the room. "This is a public place," she said quietly. "We serve anyone who wants to eat." The leader leaned back in the booth, his jacket falling open slightly. Maria caught a glimpse of metal, either a gun or a knife handle. Her training kicked in automatically, cataloging exits, potential weapons, distances between herself and threats. All the skills she had sworn she would never need again. "Lady, I'm trying to be polite here," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "We need privacy for about 10 minutes. You and the trucker can step outside, come back when we're done." "And I'm trying to do my job," Maria replied evenly. "This isn't your place to clear out. One of the younger men laughed. You got some attitude, Grandma. Maybe you didn't hear him right the first time. The leader held up a hand to silence his companion. No, she heard me fine. She's just being difficult. He looked directly at Maria. So let me make this clearer. You and your customer need to step aside. Jack, now. The way he said it made Rick look up from his plate for the first time, sensing trouble. Jimmy had stopped cooking and was listening from the kitchen. The entire diner had gone quiet except for the hum of the refrigerators and the rain against the windows. Maria felt something shift inside her, like a door that had been locked for years suddenly swinging open. She had spent 8 years being nobody, doing nothing, hurting no one. She had built a life of invisibility and safety. But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole. No, she said simply. The word hung in the air like a challenge. The leader's eyes narrowed, and his companions shifted in their seats. Rick's hand had moved closer to his phone, ready to call for help if needed. Even Jimmy had stepped closer to the serving window, probably looking for a weapon. Excuse me? The leader said. I said no. You want coffee and food? I'll serve you. You want to rent the place for a private meeting? You can talk to Abby in the morning. Right now, this is my shift, and these people stay. She could see the moment when he decided she was more trouble than she was worth. His hand moved inside his jacket, and his 3 companions tensed like springs ready to snap. Maria recognized the signs. She had lived with them for too many years to misread them now. That's when she made a choice that would change everything. Instead of backing down, instead of apologizing and stepping aside like she had trained herself to do for 8 years, Maria Santos reached up and slowly unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of her uniform shirt. The movement was deliberate, calculated, and completely unexpected. The 4 men watched, confused by what she was doing, unsure if this was surrender or something else entirely. Maria pulled the fabric aside, revealing her left shoulder and the upper part of her chest. There, etched in faded but still clearly visible black ink, was a tattoo that made the leader's face go pale. It was a skull wearing a military helmet, surrounded by crossed rifles and the words Death Brigade in Gothic lettering. Below it, smaller but equally clear, were 3 numbers that any serious criminal would recognize, numbers that represented confirmed kills, sanctioned operations, and a level of violence that most people couldn't imagine. The leader's hand stopped moving toward his weapon. His companions looked confused, not understanding what they were seeing, but their boss knew exactly what that tattoo meant. He had heard stories about the Death Brigade, rumors and legends passed down through criminal networks like ghost stories told around a campfire. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Maria slowly buttoned her shirt back up, her movements still calm and controlled. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there moments before. I asked politely the first time. I won't ask again. The rain continued to fall outside, and the fluorescent lights continued to hum, but everything else in the diner had changed. Rick sat frozen at the counter, his coffee growing cold in his hand. Jimmy remained motionless in the kitchen doorway, and the 4 men who had walked in with such confidence now sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The leader was the first to recover. He nodded slowly, understanding that he had made a serious miscalculation. We'll just have our coffee, he said quietly. No trouble. Maria poured their coffee in silence, her hands steady and professional, but inside, she felt the walls of a carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. She had revealed herself, broken her own rules, exposed the very thing she had spent 8 years trying to forget. How can? As she walked back to the counter, she could feel their eyes following her. They were trying to reconcile the quiet diner waitress with the woman who bore the mark of one of the most feared military units in recent history. She knew that look. She had seen it many times before. In other places. Other lives. The Death Brigade tattoo wasn't just ink on skin. It was a warning, a promise, and a death sentence, all rolled into one. Anyone who carried that mark had earned it through actions that most people couldn't comprehend. And anyone smart enough to recognize it knew better than to push their luck. But Maria also knew that once that door opened, it was almost impossible to close again. The life she had built here, the safety she had created, the anonymity she had fought so hard to maintain, all of it was now in jeopardy. She had spent 8 years running from her past. Tonight, for the first time since she arrived in this small Nevada town, her past had caught up with her. The question now was whether she could survive what came next. The 4 men finished their coffee in uncomfortable silence and left without incident, but Maria knew this wasn't over. Word would spread, questions would be asked. And eventually, someone would come looking for the woman behind the Death Brigade tattoo. As she cleaned up their table, Maria felt the familiar weight of decisions pressing down on her shoulders. She could run again, disappear into another town, another life, another identity. Or she could stay and face whatever consequences came from revealing herself. Either way, her quiet life at Eddie's all-night diner was over. The woman she had pretended to be for 8 years was gone, and in her place stood someone far more dangerous. Someone who had spent too many years believing she could escape what she had been trained to become. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the tracks of those who had come and gone. But some marks, Maria knew, could never be washed clean. Maria barely slept that morning. She lay in her narrow bed above the hardware store, listening to the sounds of the town coming to life below her window. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained, casting everything in grey light that matched her mood perfectly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their faces again. The moment when recognition dawned in the leader's eyes, the way his companions had looked at her, with newfound respect and fear. She had worked so hard to become invisible, and now she felt exposed, like a nerve ending suddenly lay bare. By noon, she gave up on sleep and made coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear, she had learned long ago to control fear, but from the adrenaline that still coursed through her system. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The heightened awareness, the constant scanning for threats, the readiness for violence that had once been as natural as breathing. She stood at her small kitchen window, looking down at Main Street. Everything appeared normal. Henderson was sweeping the sidewalk in front of her flower shop. Tom Miller was loading supplies into his pickup truck outside the hardware store. A few tourists wandered between the antique shops and the small museum that celebrated the town's mining history. But Maria knew that beneath this surface of small-town normalcy, things had changed. Word traveled fast in certain circles, and she had just announced herself to those circles in the most dramatic way possible. She needed information. After 8 years of trying to stay disconnected from her old world, she needed to know who those men were and who they might be working for. More importantly, she needed to know if they had recognized the significance of what they had seen. The Death Brigade had been disbanded officially for over a decade, its members scattered to the winds with new identities and strict orders never to contact each other again. The unit had never existed in any official capacity. It was a ghost operation, born in the shadows of military intelligence, and dissolved just as quietly when its usefulness ended. But unofficially, among certain criminal organizations and intelligence agencies, the Death Brigade was legendary. They had been sent where no other unit could go, tasked with eliminations that required absolute deniability. 12 operators, no names, no official records, no limits on their methods. Maria had been the only woman in the unit, codenamed Nightingale, for her ability to appear harmless, right up until the moment she struck. She had been recruited at 19, fresh out of military police training, because her psychological profile showed the perfect combination of empathy and ruthlessness that the mission required. For 6 years, she had been a weapon in human form, deployed against targets that ranged from terrorist leaders to corrupt officials to rogue scientists selling secrets. She had eliminated 37 people in 12 countries, each death meticulously planned and flawlessly executed. Then the unit had been exposed by a whistleblower, and everything fell apart. The members were given 48 hours to disappear, complete with new identities and enough money to start over anywhere in the world. The official story was that they had all died in a training accident. Unofficially, they ceased to exist. Maria had chosen this small Nevada town because it was the kind of place where people came to disappear. No major highways, no significant industry, no reason for anyone important to visit. She had spent 8 years building a life of absolute ordinariness, and it had worked perfectly until last night. Now she was faced with a choice she had hoped never to make again. She could run, abandon everything she had built here, and start over somewhere else. Or she could stand her ground and deal with whatever came next. The decision was made for her at 2 o'clock that afternoon, when Eddie Kowalski knocked on her door. "Maria, you up there? We need to talk." Eddie owned the diner, and had been the one to hire her 8 years ago, asking no questions about her past, beyond what was necessary for tax forms. He was a good man, a veteran himself who understood that some people needed a place to land without having to explain where they had come from. She opened the door to find him standing in the narrow hallway, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious concern. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Eddie entered the small apartment and stood awkwardly near the kitchen table, his hands fidgeting with his baseball cap. "Maria, I don't know what happened at the diner last night, but I got a call this morning that's got me worried." "What kind of call?" "Guy said he was with some kind of security firm. Asked if I had an employee named Maria Santos. Wanted to know about your work history, how long you'd been here, who you associate with." Eddie paused, looking uncomfortable. I didn't tell him anything, but he said he'd be coming by to talk to you personally. Maria felt her stomach drop. Security firm was code for private military contractor, and private military contractors only got involved when someone very important wanted answers. The four men from last night hadn't just recognized her tattoo. They had reported it up the chain of command. Did he give you a name, she asked. Called himself Johnson. Real original, right? Eddie shook his head. Maria, I don't know what kind of trouble you might be in, but you've been a good employee and a good person. If you need help or if you need to leave town, just say the word. It was a generous offer from a man who had already done more for her than he realized. But Maria knew that involving Eddie further would only put him in danger. I appreciate that, Eddie, really. But this is something I need to handle on my own. Do you sure? Because this Johnson guy, he didn't sound like the type who takes no for an answer. I'm sure. She placed a hand on his shoulder. But you might want to consider closing the diner for a few days. Take a vacation, visit your sister in Phoenix. Eddie's eyes widened. That bad? Could be. He nodded slowly, understanding that there were some questions better left unasked. All right. I'll lock up tomorrow morning and head out of town for a while. But Maria, you take care of yourself. Whatever this is about, it's not worth dying over. After Eddie left, Maria sat at her kitchen table and tried to think through her options. Running was still possible, but it would only delay the inevitable. If someone was interested enough to send contractors, they would find her eventually. Better to face this on her own terms, in familiar territory. She opened the drawer in her kitchen table and pulled out the one item she had saved from her previous life, a secure satellite phone that had been included in her extraction package. She had never used it, had never even turned it on, but she had kept it for exactly this kind of emergency. The phone powered up with a soft chime, and she dialed the only number programmed into its memory. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Nightingale. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Commander Harris had been the Death Brigade's handler, the only person outside the unit who knew all their real names and current locations. If anyone could tell her what she was dealing with, it was him. Harris, I need to know what's happening. Someone recognized the mark. I know. Word's been spreading since about 6 this morning. 4 contractors working for the Petrov organization claim they saw a Death Brigade tattoo on a waitress in Nevada. The Petrov organization. Maria felt her blood turn cold. Viktor Petrov was a Russian arms dealer who had been one of the Death Brigade's targets 12 years ago. The mission had been scrubbed at the last minute when political situations changed, but not before Petrov had learned he was being hunted. He's been looking for us, she said. It wasn't a question. For years. Every member who's surfaced has disappeared within 48 hours. You're the first one to reveal herself voluntarily. It wasn't voluntary. Doesn't matter. Petrov has resources, and he holds grudges. My advice is to run, now, tonight. I can have new documents to you by morning. Maria looked around her small apartment, at the life she had built from nothing. The photos on her refrigerator from the diner's Christmas party, the small herb garden she had started on her windowsill, the library books stacked on her nightstand, romance novels that would have made her old teammates laugh. No, she said quietly. Maria, this isn't the time for heroics. Petrov's not some street punk you can intimidate with a tattoo reveal. He has professional killers, military-grade equipment, and enough money to burn down your entire town just to make a point. I said no, Harris. I'm done running. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. You're not thinking clearly. You've been out of the game too long. You've gone soft. Maybe. Or maybe I've finally found something worth protecting. A diner job and a one-room apartment? A life, Harris. A real life. Something I never had when I was taking orders from you. Another pause. The offer stands. New papers, new location. Enough money to disappear permanently. But you have maybe 12 hours before Petrov's people arrive in force. Then I better get to work. She hung up the phone and sat in the silence of her apartment, feeling the weight of what she had just committed to. She was going to stand and fight, not just for her own life, but for the right to keep the life she had built. For 8 years she had been Maria Santos, waitress at Eddie's all-night diner. Quiet, harmless, invisible. But before that, she had been Nightingale, and Nightingale had never lost a target. The difference was that this time, she wasn't the hunter. She was the prey. And she had forgotten how much deadlier the prey could be when it decided to stop running. Maria went to her bedroom closet and pushed aside the uniforms and casual clothes she had accumulated over the years. In the back, wrapped in plastic and hidden behind a false wall she had installed herself, was a metal case she hadn't opened in 8 years. Inside were the tools of her former trade: weapons, communication equipment, surveillance gear, and most importantly, detailed intelligence files on every major criminal organization that had been active when the Death Brigade was operational. She found the file on Viktor Petrov and spread it across her kitchen table. The photo showed a man in his 60s now, silver-haired and distinguished, the kind who wore expensive suits and attended charity galas. But the intelligence reports told a different story. He was responsible for supplying weapons to terrorist organizations, facilitating human trafficking, and eliminating anyone who interfered with his business. The Death Brigade had been tasked with taking him out because he had been planning to sell nuclear materials to a radical group. The mission had been scrubbed when diplomats convinced the politicians that Petrov was more useful alive than dead, but by then he already knew someone was coming for him. According to the file, Petrov's security team consisted of former Spetsnaz operatives and ex-military contractors from various countries. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and absolutely loyal to their employer. But they weren't Death Brigade. Maria closed the file and began checking her weapons. The familiar weight of her service pistol, the tactical knife she had carried through a dozen countries, the small explosives that could turn everyday objects into deadly traps. She was rusty, she knew that. 8 years of pouring coffee and taking orders had softened reflexes that had once been sharp enough to keep her alive in situations most people couldn't imagine. But muscle memory was a powerful thing, and some skills never really disappeared. As the sun set outside her window, casting long shadows across her small apartment, Maria Santos began to prepare for war. Not the kind of war she had fought as part of the Death Brigade, where she had the backing of military intelligence and unlimited resources. This would be personal, messy, and probably suicidal, but for the first time in 8 years, she felt truly alive. The quiet life was over. Nightingale was coming home. They came at dawn, just as Maria had expected they would. Professional killers preferred the early morning hours when most people were asleep and law enforcement was at its thinnest. She had been watching from her window since 4 o'clock, sipping black coffee and counting vehicles that didn't belong. The first was a black SUV with tinted windows that parked across from the hardware store at 5:15. 2 men got out, trying to look casual as they positioned themselves with clear views of both her apartment entrance and the back alley. The second vehicle arrived 20 minutes later, a grey sedan that stopped at the corner, its occupants immediately taking positions that would prevent anyone from leaving the area on foot. By 6 o'clock, Maria counted at least 8 operatives forming a perimeter around her building. They were good, professional, but not invisible. She recognized the tactics from her own training. Contain the target, eliminate escape routes, then move in for extraction or elimination. Viktor Petrov wasn't taking any chances. This was a full tactical operation, not the simple revenge killing she might have expected from someone with less resources. Maria finished her coffee and made one final check of her equipment. She had spent the night preparing, not just weapons and surveillance gear, but contingencies and backup plans that would have made her old commander proud. The Death Brigade had taught her many things, but the most important was that survival often came down to being more prepared than your enemy expected. Her secure phone buzzed with an incoming message. A single word: confirmed. Harris was letting her know that these were definitely Petrov's people, and that no help would be coming from official sources. She was on her own. The apartment building had 2 official exits: the front door that opened onto Main Street and a back door that led to the alley behind the building. But Maria had spent 8 years in this place, and she knew about the third exit that nobody else did. In the basement of the hardware store, accessible through a connecting door that most people assumed led to a storage closet, was an old mining tunnel that had been sealed off decades ago. Maria had discovered it during her first month here and had quietly reopened it as an emergency escape route. The tunnel connected to a storm drain that emerged 3 blocks away, behind the abandoned gas station at the edge of town. It was her insurance policy, and today she was going to collect on it. She gathered her gear into a backpack and took one last look around the apartment that had been her home for 8 years. The photos on the refrigerator, the books on her nightstand, the small personal touches that had made this place feel safe and real. She was leaving all of that behind now, probably forever. But she wasn't running away. She was changing the battlefield. Maria slipped through the connecting door into the hardware store basement, moving silently through the darkness toward the concealed tunnel entrance. She could hear footsteps upstairs, probably the operatives moving into position for the final assault on her apartment. The tunnel was exactly as she had left it, a cramped concrete passage that smelled of dampness and decades of disuse. She crawled through the darkness for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, emerging from the storm drain behind the abandoned gas station just as the sun cleared the horizon. From this position, she had a clear view of her former building and could see the tactical team moving into their final positions. They were preparing for a simultaneous breach front and back doors, probably with explosives to ensure maximum shock and confusion. Maria smiled grimly as she watched them work. They were about to discover that their target wasn't where they expected her to be. She circled wide through the desert scrubland that surrounded the town, using cover and concealment techniques that felt rusty but still effective. Her destination was the old mining museum at the other end of Main Street, a building she had scouted years ago as a potential observation post. The museum was closed at this hour, but locks had never been much of an obstacle for someone with Maria's training. She was inside and positioned at a second-floor window within minutes, with a perfect view of the entire downtown area. At 6:45, the tactical team made their move. Maria watched through her binoculars as operatives simultaneously breached both doors of her apartment building. She could hear the explosions from 3 blocks away, followed by shouting and radio chatter as they realized their target was gone. It would take them a few minutes to search the building thoroughly and confirm that she had escaped. That gave Maria time to study their equipment and procedures, looking for weaknesses she could exploit. They were carrying military-grade weapons and communication equipment, moving with the precision of Special Forces operators, but they were also operating in an unfamiliar environment, following a plan that assumed their target would behave like a civilian rather than a trained operative. That assumption was going to cost them. Maria's secure phone buzzed with another message, this one longer. Local law enforcement has been ordered to stand down. Federal agents en route to take over investigation. You have maybe 2 hours before they lock down the entire area, so Petrov had official backing for this operation, probably through bribes or blackmail involving federal agents who owed him favors. That complicated things significantly but also presented opportunities. Corrupt officials tended to prioritize their own safety over mission success. She watched as the tactical team regrouped in the street below, their leader speaking rapidly into his radio while pointing toward different areas of the town. They would be establishing a wider perimeter now, checking every building, every hiding place, every possible escape route. But they would be looking for a frightened civilian trying to hide, not a trained operator who had spent the night turning their own tactics against them. Maria had placed small explosive charges in 3 locations around town during her preparation. Not enough to cause serious injury, but sufficient to create confusion and draw attention. She activated the first one now, a small blast in the parking lot behind the bank that sent the tactical team scrambling toward the sound. While they investigated the explosion, Maria slipped out of the museum and made her way toward the diner. Eddie had locked up and left town as she had suggested, but she still had keys and knew every inch of the building. The diner would serve as her temporary command post, and more importantly, it was where this all began. If Petrov wanted to send a message about crossing him, she would send one right back. She entered through the kitchen door and immediately began setting up surveillance equipment that would give her eyes on the entire downtown area. The diner's position at the center of Main Street made it perfect for observing enemy movements, and its solid construction would provide good protection if the situation deteriorated into a firefight. Maria's second explosive device went off 20 minutes later, this one behind the post office. She watched through her surveillance cameras as half the tactical team rushed toward the new distraction, while the other half tried to maintain their perimeter. They were getting frustrated, making mistakes, losing the discipline that made them effective. Her phone rang. Not the secure phone Harris had given her, but her regular cell phone. The number was blocked, but she knew who it would be. "Miss Santos, my name is Victor Petrov. I believe we need to talk." His voice was cultured with only a hint of accent, the kind of man who was equally comfortable discussing art or ordering executions. "Mr. Petrov. I was wondering when you'd call personally. You have caused me considerable inconvenience over the years. My organization has spent significant resources trying to locate you and your former colleagues." "Sorry to hear that. Have you considered taking up a less dangerous hobby?" There was a soft chuckle. "You have spirit, I can respect that. But you must understand that this pursuit of yours cannot continue indefinitely. My men will find you eventually, and when they do, your death will not be pleasant. Your men are having trouble finding their way around a town with 6 streets. I'm not too worried. Perhaps. But I have other resources available. For instance, I know about your friend Eddie Kowalski, currently visiting his sister in Phoenix. I know about the elderly couple who runs the flower shop and the young man who stocks shelves at the hardware store. Should my search for you prove unsuccessful, I may be forced to expand my methods." The threat was clear, and exactly what Maria had expected. Petrov specialized in psychological warfare, using innocent people as leverage to force his enemies into making mistakes. It was effective because most people had something they cared about more than their own lives. Threatening civilians is a new low even for you. Desperate times require creative solutions. But I am not an unreasonable man. Surrender yourself, and I give you my word that no one else in your little town will be harmed. Your word doesn't mean much to people who've researched your business practices. Then perhaps we can arrange a more formal agreement. Meet me tonight alone, and we can discuss terms like civilized people. The old mining office at the edge of town, midnight. Come armed if it makes you feel safer. My guards will be instructed not to interfere unless you attempt to leave. It was a trap, obviously. But it was also an opportunity. Petrov was confident enough in his numerical and equipment advantages that he was willing to face her directly. That kind of arrogance had been the downfall of many targets she had eliminated over the years. "I'll consider it," she said. "I hope you will, because if you decline this generous offer, tomorrow I begin demonstrating my displeasure on the innocent people of this town. Starting with Mrs. Henderson and her flower shop." The line went dead. Maria sat in the empty diner, surrounded by surveillance screens and weapons, and felt something she hadn't experienced in many years. Not fear. Fear was a luxury she had trained herself not to afford. But responsibility, the weight of knowing that other people's lives depended on her decisions. For 8 years, she had been concerned only with her own survival and anonymity. Now she was being forced to decide whether those innocent lives were worth risking her own carefully constructed safety. Her third explosive device went off right on schedule. Behind the antique store, she watched the tactical team's response and noted that they were becoming more cautious, less aggressive. They were starting to realize that they weren't hunting a helpless civilian. Maria checked her weapons and began planning her approach to the mining office. If Petrov wanted to meet face-to-face, she would accommodate him. But not on his terms. She had 8 hours to prepare for a confrontation that would either end this threat permanently or result in her death. Either way, the quiet life of Maria Santos was over. What emerged from tonight's meeting would be something far more dangerous. As she worked, Maria found herself thinking about the people Petrov had threatened. Mrs. Petrov, Henderson, who had been the first person to welcome her to town, Tom Miller, who had fixed her leaky faucet without charging her for the labor, Eddie, who had given her a job without asking uncomfortable questions. She had spent 8 years learning to care about these people, and now that caring was being used as a weapon against her. It was exactly the kind of leverage that the Death Brigade had been trained to exploit when they were the hunters. But leverage worked both ways. And tonight, Maria was going to remind Viktor Petrov why the Death Brigade had been disbanded rather than defeated. Some weapons were too dangerous to leave in the field, even for the people who had created them. The sun was setting over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. In a few hours, this would all be over, one way or another. Maria Santos was about to discover if 8 years of peace had made her weak, or if they had simply given her something worth fighting for. The old mining office sat at the edge of town like a tombstone marking the boundary between civilization and the vast Nevada desert. Built in the 1940s when the silver mines were still producing, it had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up and its parking lot cracked by years of heat and neglect. Maria arrived 2 hours early, using the time to study the building and its surroundings. She had expected Petrov to choose this location. It was isolated, defensible, and far enough from town that gunfire wouldn't immediately attract attention. What she hadn't expected was how thoroughly his team had prepared the site. From her observation post on a ridge a quarter-mile away, she could see snipers positioned on the surrounding hills, their scopes glinting in the moonlight. Vehicles were hidden in the desert scrub, probably containing backup teams ready to respond if the meeting went wrong. The building itself showed signs of recent activity. New security lights, communication equipment on the roof, and what looked like electronic countermeasures to prevent outside surveillance. Petrov wasn't just confident. He was paranoid enough to turn a simple meeting into a military operation. Maria adjusted her scope and began counting personnel. She identified at least 12 operatives in various positions around the site, all carrying professional-grade equipment and moving with the precision of Special Forces training. Getting close to the building would be nearly impossible without being detected. But getting close wasn't her plan. She had spent the afternoon preparing for this confrontation, not by gathering more weapons or calling for backup, but by studying everything she could find about Viktor Petrov's psychology. The Death Brigade had taught her that understanding an enemy's mind was often more valuable than superior firepower. Petrov was a man who had built his empire through intimidation and psychological warfare. He preferred to defeat his enemies by making them feel helpless rather than simply killing them. The elaborate setup around the mining office wasn't just security, it was theater, designed to demonstrate his power and make her feel outnumbered and outgunned, which meant he would be expecting her to approach like a desperate woman with limited options. He would not be expecting her to approach like Nightingale. At 11:30, Maria began her move toward the meeting site, but instead of trying to infiltrate the perimeter or find a hidden approach, she walked straight down the access road with her hands visible and her weapons holstered. The first sniper spotted her at 300 yards. She could hear radio chatter as her position was reported up the chain of command. By the time she reached the building's parking lot, she knew that at least 6 different weapons were trained on her. 2 guards emerged from concealment near the building's entrance, their automatic rifles ready but not directly aimed. They were professionals, she could tell. Alert but not jumpy, prepared for trouble but not expecting it from a lone woman walking openly toward their position. "Stop right there," one of them called out when she was 30 feet away. "Arms out to your sides." Maria complied, allowing them to approach and conduct a professional search. They found her sidearm, her tactical knife, and a small explosive device, all of which they confiscated with practiced efficiency. "Clean," the second guard reported into his radio. Bringing her in. They escorted her through the building's main entrance into what had once been the mining company's administrative office. The space had been transformed into a temporary command center with communication equipment, computers, and surveillance monitors showing feeds from cameras positioned around the perimeter. Viktor Petrov sat behind an executive desk that looked expensive and out of place in the abandoned building. He was exactly what Maria had expected, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of having people fear him. "Miss Santos, or should I call you Nightingale? Maria is fine. We're not in the military anymore." Petrov smiled and gestured to a chair positioned in front of the desk. "Please, sit. Can I offer you something to drink? Coffee, perhaps? I understand you've developed quite a fondness for it over the years." "I'm good, thanks." Maria remained standing, her eyes scanning the room and cataloging potential weapons, exits, and threats. "Old habits. As you wish." Petrov leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "You know, I've been curious about you for many years. The only woman to serve with the Death Brigade, 37 confirmed eliminations. They called you the ghost of Baghdad after that business with the arms dealers. Ancient history, perhaps. But history has a way of catching up with us, doesn't it? Especially when we've made enemies who have long memories and considerable resources."
Maria met his gaze directly. "You're the one who wanted this meeting, Petrov. What do you want?"
"What I want is justice for 12 years of looking over my shoulder, wondering when one of you Death Brigade operators would appear in my bedroom some night."
"What I want is compensation for the millions I've spent on security because your unit made me a target. The mission was scrubbed. We never came for you. But you were going to, weren't you? You studied my operations, my security procedures, my personal habits. You planned my death in exquisite detail." Petrov's voice remained calm, but Maria could see the anger burning behind his eyes. "Do you have any idea what that knowledge does to a man, knowing that somewhere out there highly trained killers are planning to end your existence? Welcome to the club. That's what it feels like to be one of your victims." Petrov laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "My victims chose to involve themselves in my business. You and your colleagues were simply following orders from people who decided I was inconvenient. You were selling nuclear materials to terrorists. I was conducting business transactions with clients who had specific needs. The moral implications were not my concern." Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being in the presence of genuine evil. Petrov wasn't just a criminal. He was the kind of person who could justify any atrocity as long as it served his interests. "So what happens now?" she asked. "You've got me here, surrounded by your private army. Are you going to torture me for information about my former teammates? Kill me slowly to make a point? Or did you actually have something to propose?" "I'm going to offer you a choice," Petrov said, opening a laptop on his desk and turning the screen toward her. "Your former colleagues have been remarkably difficult to locate, but you, my dear, have just provided me with a different kind of opportunity." The laptop screen showed surveillance footage from around town. Mrs. Henderson watering her flowers, Tom Miller loading his truck, children walking to school, people going about their normal lives in blissful ignorance of the danger surrounding them. These people have become attached to you, Petrov continued, and you, I suspect, have become attached to them. It's a weakness I can exploit. Get to the point. Work for me. Use your skills in my service. And these innocent people continue their peaceful lives. Refuse, and I demonstrate what happens to communities that harbor my enemies. Maria stared at the screen, watching people she had come to care about, living their normal lives just a few miles away. It was exactly the kind of leverage she had used against targets when she was working for the Death Brigade. Find what they valued most and threaten it. What kind of work? I have competitors who need to be eliminated. Government officials who require persuasion. Business associates who have become unreliable. The same work you did for your military handlers, except this time you'll be properly compensated. And if I refuse? Petrov touched a key on his laptop, and the screen changed to show a man with a rifle positioned on a hill overlooking town. My sniper has Mrs. Henderson in his crosshairs right now. One radio call from me, and she becomes the first casualty in a very unpleasant demonstration of my resolve. Maria looked at the screen and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, but calculation. Petrov thought he held all the cards, but he had made one critical mistake. He had focused so much on threatening the people she cared about that he had forgotten who she used to be. You know what the problem is with your plan? Maria asked, her voice conversational. Enlighten me. You've been out of the field too long. You've gotten used to intimidating businessmen and politicians, people who value their own comfort over everything else. She took a step closer to the desk. But I'm not a businessman or a politician. No? You're a waitress who's been out of the killing business for 8 years, am I? Maria smiled. And for the first time since entering the building, she saw uncertainty flicker across Petrov's face. Because here's what you missed, Victor. While you were positioning snipers and setting up your elaborate security perimeter, I was doing what I was trained to do. She reached into her pocket slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. The guards tensed but didn't intervene as she pulled out her cell phone. I spent today placing shaped charges in very specific locations around your operation, the ridge where your primary sniper is positioned, the wash where your backup vehicles are hidden, the communication relay you installed on the water tower. She showed him the phone screen, which displayed a simple app with red buttons labeled with numbers. One touch, and your entire operation becomes a crater in the desert. Petrov's composure cracked slightly. You're bluffing. My men would have detected any explosive devices. Your men are good, but they're not Death Brigade. We were trained to place charges that are invisible until they detonate. Maria set the phone on the desk where Petrov could see it clearly. The question now is whether you want to test that training. The room fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of wind across the desert. Petrov stared at the phone, trying to determine if she was telling the truth. His guards remained frozen, unsure whether to act without orders. Even if you're not bluffing, Petrov said finally. Triggering those charges would kill you as well. This building is within the blast radius. Probably. But that's the difference between us, Victor. You've spent 12 years being afraid to die. I spent 6 years learning how. Maria picked up the phone and held her thumb over one of the red buttons. So here's my counteroffer. You and your men disappear. Tonight. Forever.
And in exchange, you get to keep breathing. And if I refuse? Then Mrs. Henderson gets to read about the mysterious explosion that killed a group of international criminals who were threatening her town.
She might even send flowers to the memorial service. For the first time since she had entered the building, Maria saw real fear in Viktor Petrov's eyes. He had built his empire on the assumption that everyone valued their own life above all else. But he was facing someone who had been trained to see death as simply another tool to accomplish the mission. The silence stretched out for nearly a minute before Petrov finally spoke. You realize this won't end here. I have associates, other enemies of your unit. Word of this will spread. Then I guess I better make sure the message is clear. Maria's thumb hovered over the detonator. You've got 60 seconds to start evacuating your people. After that, I start pushing buttons just to see what happens. Petrov reached for his radio with movements that seemed almost reluctant. All units, fall back to secondary positions. Prepare for immediate extraction. Faster, Maria said, watching the numbers count down on her phone's display. Your sniper is still aiming at Mrs. Henderson. Overwatch team, disengage and relocate immediately. Through the building's windows, Maria could see lights moving in the distance as vehicles started up and personnel began withdrawing from their positions. But she knew this was far from over. Petrov would retreat tonight, but a man like him didn't give up after a single confrontation. "The next time we meet," he said, standing behind his desk, "I won't underestimate you. There won't be a next time, Victor, because if I see you or any of your people within 100 miles of this town, I won't bother with threats or negotiations. I'll just start killing until there's nobody left to threaten." Petrov nodded slowly, understanding that he was hearing a promise rather than a bluff. He gathered his laptop and moved toward the door, flanked by his guards. "You know," he said, pausing at the threshold, "you really would have made an excellent employee. I already had a job." After they left, Maria remained in the empty building for another hour, listening to the sounds of vehicles disappearing into the desert night. Only when she was certain they were truly gone did she allow herself to examine her hands, which were shaking slightly from the adrenaline that had been coursing through her system. She looked down at her phone and laughed quietly. The detonator app was real enough that there were no explosives connected to it. She had spent the afternoon placing fake charges and counting on Petrov's paranoia to fill in the gaps in her bluff. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon was the one that existed only in the enemy's imagination. Maria walked out of the mining office and began the long hike back to town, knowing that her life had changed forever. She could never be just a waitress again, could never pretend that her past didn't exist. But for the first time in 8 years, she felt like she was exactly who she was supposed to be. Dawn was breaking over the desert as she reached the outskirts of town, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In a few hours, Mrs. Rachel Henderson would open her flower shop, Tom Miller would start his truck, and life would continue in the small Nevada town that had become her home. And Victor Petrov would be somewhere far away, telling his associates about the night he met Nightingale and learned why some ghosts were better left undisturbed. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the mining office, Maria Santos stood in the kitchen of Eddie's all-night diner, watching the morning crowd enjoy their breakfast. Everything looked normal. Truckers drinking coffee at the counter, local families sharing pancakes in the booths, the familiar sounds of conversation and clinking silverware filling the air. But nothing was really the same. Eddie had returned from Phoenix with questions in his eyes that he was too polite to ask. The federal agents who had arrived to investigate the terrorist activity in town had left after finding nothing more than some blast marks in the desert and a few confused local residents. The story that made it into the regional newspaper described a training exercise gone wrong, with no casualties and minimal property damage. Only Maria knew the real story, and she intended to keep it that way. She poured coffee for Rick, the trucker who had been eating meatloaf when this all began. He nodded his thanks and went back to reading the sports section, completely unaware that his quiet conversation about road conditions had been the beginning of events that nearly destroyed their small town. "You're looking better," Eddie said, joining her behind the counter. "More relaxed. Whatever was bothering you before seems to have worked itself out." "Something like that," Maria replied, refilling the coffee pot. "Thanks for giving me time to handle it. You sure you don't want to talk about it? I mean, I know it's none of my business, but those federal agents seem pretty interested in what happened here." Maria considered how much she should tell him. Eddie deserved some kind of explanation after everything he had done for her, but the full truth would only put him in danger. "I had some trouble with people from my past. It's been resolved." "For good?" "I think so." Eddie studied her face for a moment, then nodded.
Well, if you ever need anything else, you just let me know. This place wouldn't be the same without you.
It was a simple statement, but it hit Maria harder than she had expected.
For 8 years she had told herself that her life here was temporary, that she was just hiding until it was safe to move on to something else. But somewhere along the way, this place had become home, and these people had become family. The bell above the door chimed, and Maria looked up to see Mrs. Henderson entering with her usual Monday morning smile. She took her regular seat at the counter and ordered her regular breakfast. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and tea instead of coffee. "How's the flower business?" Maria asked, setting down the teacup. "Oh, you know how it is. Spring's coming, so everyone wants to spruce up their gardens. I've been busier than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Mrs. Henderson laughed at her own expression. "Tom Miller ordered 6 flats of petunias yesterday. Said he wants to surprise his wife for their anniversary." Normal conversation about normal things. It was exactly what Maria had been fighting to protect, even though Mrs. Henderson would never know how close she had come to becoming a casualty in someone else's war. The morning passed quietly with the usual flow of customers and familiar routines. Maria found herself paying attention to details she had overlooked for years. The way the sunlight streamed through the windows, the comfortable weight of the coffee pot in her hand, The satisfaction of getting someone's order exactly right. She had spent so long focused on simply surviving that she had forgotten to notice the life she was living. Around noon, when the lunch rush was beginning to build, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Maria's hand automatically moved toward the kitchen knife she now kept within easy reach, her body tensing as two men in dark suits got out of the car. But these weren't Petrov's operatives. She could tell immediately from the way they moved. Confident but not predatory, alert but not aggressive. Government agents, probably FBI, here to tie up loose ends from their investigation. They entered the diner and chose a booth near the window, ordering coffee and sandwiches like any other customers. But Maria noticed how they positioned themselves to observe the entire restaurant and how one of them kept glancing in her direction. She served their coffee with professional neutrality, but she could feel them studying her, trying to reconcile the quiet waitress with whatever information they had received about recent events. "Excuse me," the older agent said when she brought their food. "Could we speak with you privately for a few minutes?" "I'm working," Maria replied. "If you need something official, you can talk to my boss. This won't take long. Just a few questions about what you might have observed 3 weeks ago."
Maria glanced around the diner.
Eddie was in the kitchen, and most of the customers were focused on their meals. She could refuse to answer questions without a warrant, but that would only make them more suspicious. 5 minutes, she said, but we talk here where everyone can see us. The agents exchanged a look that suggested they had expected this kind of caution. The younger one pulled out a small notebook while his partner leaned forward slightly. "We're investigating reports of unusual activity in this area. Possible terrorist surveillance, weapons caches, that sort of thing. Did you notice any strangers in town around that time? People who seemed out of place?" "Strangers come through here all the time," Maria said. "It's a truck stop." "What about the night in question?" "We have reports of explosions, possible gunfire." "You would have been working that night." "I called in sick that night." "Stomach flu. Eddie can confirm that." It was a lie, but one that Eddie would back up without question if asked. She had already spoken to him about providing that alibi if anyone came asking. The older agent studied her face for signs of deception. "Mrs. Santos, we have reason to believe that a dangerous international criminal was in this area recently. Viktor Petrov. Have you ever heard that name?" Maria kept her expression neutral despite the shock of hearing Petrov's name spoken aloud in her diner. "Should I have? He's involved in arms trafficking, human smuggling, various other criminal activities. If he or his associates made contact with anyone in town, it would be important for us to know about it. I serve coffee and take orders," Maria said. "I don't know anything about international criminals." The younger agent looked frustrated, but his partner seemed to accept her answers at face value. After a few more routine questions, they paid for their meal and left, but not before leaving a business card with instructions to call if she remembered anything else. Maria watched their car disappear down the highway and felt a mixture of relief and concern. The fact that the FBI was still looking into Petrov's activities suggested that his organization remained active, even if he had personally withdrawn from the area. She would need to stay alert, but she was confident that the immediate threat had passed. Petrov was too smart to risk another direct confrontation, especially after learning what kind of opponent he was dealing with. The rest of the day passed without incident, and by evening Maria was beginning to relax into the familiar rhythms of her work. She was closing out the register when her secure phone, which she had kept with her ever since the confrontation, buzzed with an incoming message. The text was brief: "Package delivery tomorrow. Personal courier. Thank you for your service. H." Harris was sending her something, probably new identity documents, in case she needed to relocate quickly. It was a thoughtful gesture, but Maria realized that she had no intention of using them. She had found her place in the world, and she wasn't going to be driven away from it again. The next morning, the courier arrived during the breakfast rush. He was young, maybe 25, with the clean-cut appearance of military or ex-military. He ordered coffee and waited until the diner was nearly empty before approaching the counter. "Maria Santos?" he asked quietly. She nodded, and he handed her a thick envelope that felt heavy in her hands, from a mutual friend. "He said you'd know what to do with it." After he left, Maria took the envelope to the back office and opened it carefully. Inside was a new passport, driver's license, and other documents in the name of Sarah Mitchell. There was also a bank account number and access codes, along with a brief note in Harris's handwriting. "Nightingale, your service record has been officially expunged. As far as the government is concerned, you never existed. The Death Brigade was a classified program that has been permanently sealed. You're free to live whatever life you choose. The account contains your accumulated back pay and a pension. You earned it. Stay safe. H. Maria looked at the documents for a long time, then walked to the diner's small safe and locked them away. They represented freedom, the ability to disappear completely and start over anywhere in the world. But they also represented the past, and she was finally ready to move beyond that. She returned to the counter and poured herself a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the small town that had given her a second chance at life. Mrs. Henderson was arranging flowers in front of her shop. Tom Miller was helping an elderly customer load supplies into her car. Children were walking to school, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. This was real, this was worth protecting. And this was where she belonged. 6 months later, Maria was still working at Eddie's all-night diner, still living in her small apartment above the hardware store, still pouring coffee and taking orders. But something fundamental had changed in how she approached each day. She had stopped looking over her shoulder constantly, stopped cataloging exits and potential weapons everywhere she went. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive for so many years was slowly fading, replaced by something she had never really experienced before: contentment. She had also started getting involved in the community in ways she had previously avoided. She volunteered at the local library, helped organize the annual Harvest Festival, and even joined a book club that met at Mrs. Henderson's flower shop. For the first time in her adult life, Maria Santos was living as herself rather than as someone playing a role. She was discovering who she might have become if she had never been recruited by the Death Brigade, never trained to be a weapon, never learned to see the world as a collection of threats to be neutralized. The transformation wasn't complete, probably never would be. She still carried a weapon, still maintained escape routes and contingency plans, still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night with her hand reaching for a gun that wasn't there. Some training was too deep to ever completely fade, but she was learning to live with those habits rather than being controlled by them. She was discovering that strength didn't always have to come from being ready for violence, that safety could come from being part of a community rather than standing apart from it. One evening, as she was closing the diner, Eddie approached her with a proposal that surprised her. "Maria, I've been thinking about retiring. Nothing immediate, but maybe in a year or two. I'm getting too old for the restaurant business." He paused, seeming nervous. "I was wondering if you might be interested in buying the place. I'd give you a good deal, work out a payment plan that makes sense." Maria looked around the diner that had been her sanctuary for 8 years. The thought of owning it, of putting down roots that deep, was both terrifying and appealing. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course." "No pressure. But I figured if anyone should take over this place, it ought to be someone who understands what it means to people." That night, Maria sat in her apartment and thought about Eddie's offer. Buying the diner would mean committing to staying in this town permanently, accepting that her life as Maria Santos was real rather than temporary. She thought about the scared woman who had arrived here 8 years ago, desperate to disappear and willing to take any job that came with no questions asked. She thought about the person she had been before that. Nightingale, the ghost who could end lives with surgical precision and disappear without a trace. And she thought about who she was now, someone who knew her customers' names and their usual orders, someone who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, someone who was part of a community that extended far beyond the walls of a small diner. The next morning, she told Eddie she was interested in his offer. "Really?" His face lit up with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful. This place needs someone who cares about it." "I do care about it," Maria realized as she spoke the words. "More than I thought I could care about anything." They shook hands on the deal, agreeing to work out the details over the coming months. As Eddie walked away, whistling tunelessly, Maria felt something she had never experienced before: excitement about the future rather than anxiety about the past. She was going to own a restaurant. She was going to be a businesswoman, a member of the Chamber of Commerce, someone with a stake in the community's success. It was so far from anything she could have imagined during her years with the Death Brigade that she almost laughed out loud. But it was also exactly what she wanted. That afternoon, Mrs. Henderson stopped by for her usual tea and eggs. As Maria served her, the older woman smiled and patted her hand gently. "I heard about you buying the diner. That's wonderful news. Eddie told you already?" "Honey, in a town this size, news travels faster than wildfire. Everyone's excited. You've become part of this place. And now this place gets to become part of you." Later that evening, after the dinner rush had ended and the diner had settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, Maria stood behind the counter and looked around at her future business. The worn booths that would need reupholstering. The coffee machine that made strange noises but still brewed perfect coffee. The the view from the windows that showed her small town under the glow of streetlights. It wasn't much, but it was hers, or would be soon enough. She thought about the envelope locked in the safe, the documents that would let her become Sarah Mitchell and disappear forever. She had kept them as insurance, but she knew now that she would never use them. Maria Santos wasn't running anymore. She had found her place in the world, and she was going to defend it not with weapons or violence, but with the simple act of belonging. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. Inside, the diner hummed with quiet life, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. For the first time in her adult life, Maria Santos was exactly where she wanted to be,